All right, so this will be a tutorial on basic VR. So we're going to learn about the VR rig and how to place it in the space, get your VR rolling, and then we're going to learn about a simple touch on locomotion. We've got other tutorials on that. And then we're going to also talk about interactions. I just set up a little terrain here so we can have some context and a place to fly over in VR. I'm going to use a horizon here to make it summer midday and kind of brighten up the scene. And I'm going to put some objects, just basic objects in the space so that when we interact, when we go into kind of VR, we'll have some stuff in the foreground, some stuff in the background, and we'll be able to kind of like see ourselves moving around. So here's a little scene, super rudimentary, but it is a perfect place to learn. All right, so VR is handled in this manner. Over here in the toolbox on the top level, you'll see VR. And once you select VR, your VR options down here look like VR rig preset, VR rig blank, VR rig gaze, and then a few things that you can do in kind of building up the VR rig blank. The VR rig preset is what I'm going to teach you now, and it gives you an initial set of interactive capabilities and locomotion. And so what I do is press VR AR over here in the top level and then get the sub item. You're going to pick the preset and click it somewhere on the terrain in the space. And if you're in a terrain space, yeah, you need to kind of click onto terrain or onto some node, and it'll place the VR rig at that location. The VR rig is the sort of like object, it's the representation of your ground center point. This is kind of considered in the VR rig's like frame of reference. This little point right here is where you calibrated your VR system, Vive, Oculus, Windows, mixed reality. It's like ground plane center with respect to forward, back, left, right, X and Z. Yeah. So that point, and then the system, Simmetri, and in working with Steam VR and Oculus and Windows Mixed Reality, gets your positions of your hands, each of your controllers, relative to their offset relative to that base center point. And this is your camera icon for your VR HMD. You'll see HMD camera up here. You'll see a few words representing the interactions there, and then this thing called VR rig here. Let's take a look at it in the hierarchy. A little bit of repeat. The HMD camera, this is the camera virtually looking into the space that'll render stereoscopically to your headset. And you've got your right hand and your left hand. And these are all the children here under the VR rig. Again, you can expand it with this triangle, and you see the left hand, the right hand, and the HMD camera. If you expand the hands, you'll notice that there is a grip trigger, an index trigger, and a laser pointer. So consistent with all of the kind of 6DoF, Vive, Oculus, and mixed reality headsets, you're going to have a grip trigger. That's the sort of pinky through middle finger sort of grip area, and then the index is your index finger. There is a thumb pad which you can access, but we don't kind of put in this hierarchy, and you can access it and write scripts for it here under the hand. Each hand has a thing called a device player controller, and each of these events are fired when the button is pressed. And so you can kind of link up the controls to scripts doing this if you want to write your own custom scripts. If not, we have ones inbuilt. So if you expand the grip trigger, you're going to see one that's just a generic interact under grip on the left hand, and on the left hand under index triggers is a node called fly. And each of these is a code. It's a node filled with code that kind of imbues the grip trigger with a particular interaction mode. So in the VR rig preset, we've bound it to have your left index trigger fly. So if you press your left index trigger, and we're going to see this in a second, you're going to fly wherever your left hand is pointed. So you can point forward, right, left, up, down, back, behind you, and you'll fly backwards. You can fly to the side. You can fly up. And then the Interact is a system that works with the interactions over here. Sorry, excuse me, I keep docking it. Interactions where you have a set of presets, and I'll show you a few of these, and I'll show you what it's like to build a custom interaction, which is awesome because then you can basically put interactions all over the world and script up a pretty robust and interactive scene very quickly. And then you'll also notice that on the left hand and on the right hand, you have what's called the laser pointer. Oops, I think I selected a tract. Anyway, yeah, so you have what's called the laser pointer, and that's representative of this interactive laser. You can change all the kind of features about the laser pointer. If you right click, you can edit the code here, and you can kind of change its laser distance, its maximum laser distance, its sample distance, and you'll kind of get a smaller laser or a larger laser. And that basically works like a laser pointer that then, when it intersects with any object, and I'll show you this in a second, it's going to interact with that object the way that that object has been programmed to interact using one of these interactions or one of your own custom. And so then in the VR rig, we're looking at the VR rig preset. The preset rig has the left hand flies index, interacts grip. Right hand, it interacts on grip, and it has a free index trigger. And so I'm going to give you a sense of what that interaction looks like. When I click interactions, I'm going to say grabbable fixed, and this is something I'm going to select here, and I'm going to imbue the fixed grabbability interaction onto an object that's in the space. So I'm going to say, for example, this cube right out here, and it says grabbable interaction set onto box entity 4. So I've just made this. Give you a better view of that box there. This box is now going to be grabbable in VR present time. So let's check it out. So if I press play, no, the VR isn't doing anything. And if I press present, the VR isn't doing anything else. So you have to turn on VR up here. And this is what you'd call VR mode. And VR mode is enabled by pressing VR. And when I press VR, here I can, it's in the background, but the Steam VR window has popped up. And it's saying ready. And go back to Simmetri. So Steam VR is opened up, and if your camera, if everything's kind of in tracking position, now you'll see that in VR mode, even in stop time or pause time or play time, any of these times, you're going to see that the HMD is tracking. That's propped up on my forehead, and each of these controllers is tracking, and these lasers extend out from the forward direction. So now, if I press play, nothing will really happen in this mode. What you need to do is go into here, and now that you're in VR mode, you'll see the present mode or the present time button has a little VR in it. So this is going to be the way to access VR. And so when we press VR here, we are going to now see on the screen that you're seeing here, it's going to be a stereoscopic readout, and that this is what's getting rendered. This is the texture getting rendered to the eyes inside of the VR headset. And there's a way, and I can show you how to view monoscopically what kind of this first person view if you want to see that. And I'll show you that a little bit later. So you're going to see me interacting now in stereoscopic. I'm holding my controllers in front of my face, and I'm flying forward, and I have arrived at this cube that we can interact with. If I use the grip trigger, you can see it kind of here. You see the grip trigger kind of animated and closed. We use this generic, control looking control mesh kind of object, a compound object here, so that it's agnostic across all the different headsets. So when you publish, if you publish a VR experience in Simmetri, it'll work across all those other devices. And instead of putting in an actual Vive mesh and an Oculus mesh, which you can do, you can come in and replace them, absolutely. But just by default, we put in kind of an Oculus one. So you'll notice that this button right here, this is my left index trigger. When I press that, you'll see that I start to fly up in the air because I'm pointed in the up direction. If I point it down and press the index trigger, I fly to the ground. And so that's the fly mechanic. And interestingly, people who find themselves to have a little bit of motion sickness tend to find this to be less motion sickness making, like very little. People who get sick under other locomotions tend to, I tuned it based on research that that we tend to want to be at a constant velocity. So we get sick when we feel acceleration, but don't feel the force. And we feel force only when we're accelerating. So that's change in velocity over change in time. And so the amount that I press and squeeze the index trigger as I'm pointing in a direction is the amount that I'll move. And so I can control the velocity, but the ramp, the amount of acceleration is minimal. And I think that's part of what makes this a pretty comfortable locomotion. Additionally, I think what makes it comfortable is the fact that your body is kind of kinesthetically aware and engaged in the act of pointing and saying, I'm preparing to go over here. And there's kind of this connection between your physical intention to travel and then the resulting perception that you've traveled. And so anyway, the fly mechanic is it's my personal favorite. It's the company favorite, but there's others, and we've got tutorials for those. If you want to teleport, that's available, and if you want to cruise around on like a character using your thumb pad, that's also available. So anyway, so then I'm flying around, and if my laser is intersecting with an object, and that object is imbued with an interaction, I can then use the grip trigger, because grip trigger was interact for each of these hands, and this one was grabbable fixed, which means that the object is grabbable, and it remains fixed around the point that I grabbed it. Meaning if I rotate or move, it moves with me. So it's constrained kind of to all 6 degrees of freedom. And I can now move it around. Well, this cube, it was not grabbable, not interactive, but this one was. So I can actually use this one to kind of manipulate others, which is kind of fun. It gives you different different abilities to kind of constrain the experience and make the experience make the experience creative and playful in different ways. And then you can kind of have you obviously with the interactions, you can script up a bunch of different personalities. Additionally, you can build a compound object using units and or parent-child hierarchies, and you're going to end up with the ability to have like buttons. This button interactive may do one thing, and then the next button does another thing. If I swing my arm, as I swing it, if I release the grip trigger, as when I would release the object, I will be able to get a pretty good throw. And I've always been surprised at how kind of accurate that can be. So that's the grab interaction. That's the fly mechanic. Those are available out of the box on the VR preset rig. And let's go a couple steps deeper here. You'll notice that there's our section called viewports. Pretty much, it's kind of a one-to-one relationship between cameras, but for the most part, you can switch out cameras into different viewports. And each viewport has kind of a set of controls and views that let you kind of engage the world. Now, the terrain space viewport comes from this editor kind of default camera, and that's the camera that kind of flies around as you're building it typically. The HMD camera viewport is, you're actually seeing it getting moved around on my head. That's being fed by the view coming out of the HMD head-mounted display camera from the VR rig. So if you look in the VR rig and kind of collapse your hands down, that HMD camera is the camera. It's the view layer of the HMD viewport. So if you select back and forth between these viewports, you'll be able to kind of see what the VR person might see upon their first experience, or on their first moment when they step in. It doesn't matter which viewport you are selected in. Let me just double check that. It doesn't matter which viewport you are selected in when you press present, because by default, the HMD camera viewport is what's considered the active viewport. That's the viewport that's going to be presented upon present time. And then all the player controls and views stem from there. And then any scripts that are running that change the active viewport or change the camera fed to that viewport will run and change that logic. But in general, if you're just trying to create a VR experience, you don't really need to worry too much about this viewport, except for kind of when you're editing and you want to not mess around from the VR viewport. You want to be messing around. You want to kind of edit from this neutral default view terrain space viewport, and then when you go into VR, you'll be immersed in this the active viewport, the presenting active viewport for the HMD camera viewport. That's a little bit about the viewports there. One thing to notice is that your VR rig, you're going to want if you want your VR rig, you can fly, right? If you have the preset. But if you want people to start on the ground, you want to make sure that the VR rig, this top level node over these other items, you want to make sure that this is level with the ground, which means that you want to zero out the Y value. So you could drag this, or you can always double click this scrub bar and it'll take you to 0. You just hit it right, and we've got 0. Or you could select and hit 0, all pretty simple. And that will mean that when we start, and you also don't want any rotation. Well, Y is fine. Y makes sense. Using the Y rotation will orient the initial kind of forward direction. So your VR system is attuned, or it has been calibrated with a forward direction. That's why it has you look forward when you set it up. So whichever direction, if you're sitting with the headset pointed forward, and you can now kind of see the frustum, and you could also see it here too. You can see what from the HMD viewport, you can see which direction you're looking. So if I have the VR headset pointed forward, and I select the VR rig in the hierarchy, I can rotate the Y rotation. I want the Y rotation to aim at kind of where I think is general forward, or first forward is a way I like to think about it. So what's my first forward? What's my first position? Y at 0 means we're on the ground, and Y rotation means that we are pointed. We're going to be pointed in that direction by default. Obviously, somebody might get into your VR experience, and they might be pointed all kinds of different directions. If you were at some event or whatever, like a show, and they might be facing all directions, but oftentimes you'll be setting them up to experience it in a particular direction. And then a lot of people that will have their devices at home, they kind of have their forward position pretty calibrated. The other thing is your rotations. For any reason it looks like your ground plane is not matching if your virtual ground plane doesn't match your actual floor ground plane, it might be because this guy X or Z got tilted, and that can happen through a couple of different mistakes. I won't bore you with those details, but just always know that if the VR rig top level node, if you're in stop time, you're going to be able to place it and rotate it to be your first position. And then you just want to check and make sure that X and Z rotations aren't rotated, because that'll have the person inside there kind of askew. So perfect. So that's a little bit about how you kind of get in and out of VR. One thing I forgot to mention is that when you're in VR here and you want to exit, you're going to take your VR headset off, and then on the computer, just like present time on Simmetri, as a reminder, you're going to hit escape, and escape will bring you back in, and you'll see the green outline on the entire user interface, and that means you're in pause time. And then if you want, if you've moved things, you could commit those playtime transforms by selecting them and pressing Control T. For new users, you might not know what that means, but if you've moved things inside of your VR experience, at this point, you can commit them selecting them and hitting Control T. And that's under what's called committing transform changes. Otherwise, the items will go back to where they began upon stop time. Let me give you a little example of that. So if I go into VR here I start out in that position. The ground is perfectly calibrated. My feet feel as if they would be on the ground, and I'm sure I can fly up off the ground. That's okay. And remember this one had a grabbable interaction on it. And if I place it over there, let's say that I wanted it to live up there. When I hit escape, it'll stay there. But if I hit stop, it'll jump back, and we'll jump back to stop time. We'll go back to our last editing viewport, and we can continue editing. But if, for example, I want the box, let's go back to the VR. If I want the box to stay here, when I press escape, and I select this particular object and hit Control T, you'll see this transform changes committed. Then when I hit stop, it stays there. So that allows you to do a little bit of construction. There's a lot more immersive construction and building and animation tools arriving soon, and they're super cool and fun to work with. But that's kind of a basic one if you wanted to construct. So let's actually go through a list of these other interactions and give you a sense of what you can build really quickly. So we're gonna work right now from the terrain space viewport, and we're gonna place some interactions out in this space. So we already have one, which is grabbable fixed. I'm gonna move this guy back down. So this one has grabbable fixed, and I'm gonna show you grabbable fixed, but this one is gonna have a rigid body. That's the physics controller basically for this object. I'm gonna make it not movable false, and also I'll make a third one which is movable inactive. So to have grabbable on the interactions, we have two grabbables: grabbable fixed and grabbable loose. To have grabbable at all, the rigid body needs to be on the object, and it can be active or inactive. And if it's active, it can be movable or immovable, and you'll get a few different uh, results from that. So let's color these out. So rigid body, the one that's movable, we will make let's make it fully green. Green for go, be moving. This is a rigid body that is not movable. Movable false. So let's make it actually like red for stop, so you can remember it. And then the ghostly. So this one will actually, this inactive one will kind of have like a ghostly look. So we'll do some sort of a gray. All right, so let's take a look. So this is 3 different types of grabbable fixed. All right, so you saw green. Green is it's a movable rigid body and it's grabbable. And this I can throw. So if I want things that I can pick up and kind of I can actually throw, and things that'll fall back to the ground and so on. That's the thing I want. Grabbable fixed, and rigid body movable true. And again, this will interact with other objects, and it has proper kind of physical constraints. You'll see that the laser point kind of flexes. You'll see that it kind of flexes, especially when I go in the down direction. I don't have a lot of I can't really do anything here. There's a physical constraint. Think of it like a spring, kind of like I've got at the point where my laser has attached to this guy. There's like a spring, so it will interact with that kind of springiness, and you'll see there's kind of some give, and you'll feel that, and it's very intuitive. It feels kind of right. You'll notice that the red one's already floating. Both of these are floating off the ground. That's because their rigid body, in this case, is movable false. In this case, is inactive, and that means it's not getting pulled down by gravity. But if this one, I can grab it, right, and it moves that same sort of lag and spring, the constraint of the green, but when I release it, it stays put. So this is like I call this kind of magic stair step, because other things can rest on it, and I can move it around, but it stays fixed. Super useful, really awesome. You kind of can construct a lot of cool stuff using that. And then this, it's oh yeah, I'm a fool. This one, the way that this works is that it's temporarily made movable, and this one, it's actually temporarily made active. So when I move it into something, it's actually going to have, it won't act like a ghost, the gray one where it's inactive. However, while it's floating, it's ghostly. So things don't really move into it. Now that's kind of useful for things that are like, like even like a UI panel or something. Like if you were going to have, like a sign that you don't want engaging in the physics, you might, have even like a large text entity or something, or like a visual screen, maybe a screen that you've got like coming in from outside video feeds like Resolume or whatever. Okay, so that's 3 types of grabbable fixed. We will, let me move back to the train space editor. Let's put another entity in the space. We'll do, let's do a tube, just for grins. Okay, so this is going to be grabbable loose, and so we'll make this one yellow. And so interactions grabbable loose. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So grabbable loose constrains to 3 degrees of freedom the positions, but not the rotation. So it's as if I've kind of got this little pin here. Now, if you were to use, I've used this interaction for like in certain ways making certain types of throw mechanics. This makes sense with spinners, things that you want to kind of spin and whip. I experimented with it definitely with like this kind of like polo or like golf club kind of mechanic. But I don't know, it's quirky. It also gives you a good, when you fling, you get a pretty good rotation. Let's come back here, buddy. So like, I don't know. I mean, that one gets a pretty good. I don't know, you can get a good spin going on it. Anyway, grabbable loose is that one. So we'll take a look at a few others, and you can experiment with them, and then I'm going to show you generic. Go back to terrain space viewport. Then I'm going to show you some generic ones. So VR, oh no, sorry, interactions. Well, like glow, for example. And let's do interactions, attract. So this one's going to glow, this one's going to attract. Let's do slow time on this one. And then let's do teleportable too, and I'll show you that other locomotion here. What I'm going to do is actually make like a little lily pad situation. And you can think of these as like waypoints, maybe. And then I'll make another one that's like out here, like bigger. Oh, and here, interactions, teleportable to, click, 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 click. And then interactions. Let's make the this gray thing glow on hover and expand on hover. So these are two examples of a hover interaction. That work? Let's take a look. Grabbable glow, and then let's do expand hover. Oh, expand hover needs an object with no rigid body, so we'll do expand hover on this object here, and I'm going to remove its rigid body by going up to rigid body and hitting remove attribute, and we'll give it a kind of a bright green color. And interactions, hover and glow, we'll put that on that one too. I realize I've been in pause time, and I kind of want everything to stay where it is. So I am going to select at least all these last things I put in here and hit Control-T, commit those transforms. All right, so let's give these some kind of color. Okay, so here's what we have. We have grabbable fixed on a movable rigid body. We have grabbable fixed on a non-movable rigid body. Grabbable fixed on a inactive rigid body, which means that I can move through it when it's not being grabbed and it stays in space. And you'll see that then the green one will rest on the red one. Okay, grabbable loose, teleportable too. Oh yeah, and by the way, that's hover glow, and I don't see. Did I put expand on the green one? Interactions. Okay, I think I just added it. It should work unless something's quirky. There you go. It's expanding now. So that's like kind of like a button mechanic, or I might say, oh, it gives me that feedback that something's going to happen. I kind of like the mechanic of like hover for glow, and you can toggle the glow amount or change the glow amount, and then click for actually expand on hover and then glow on click. Anyway, so purple is teleportable too. If you point at it and click the interact button, grip. I teleport to just slightly behind the point that I click on. I don't know if I selected, if I put it on that one. Put it on that one for sure. Put it on this one. So you can imagine it working like waypoints. I mean, so in this case, it's like if I click here, 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 I don't jump to it. But that way you could kind of constrain people to a particular space. Another teleportation you might want to do is put it on a larger space, say your ground plane or something, and then people can kind of teleport to any place on that plane. And pretty nice. Let's see here. So we got this whole. So that's, what's that? That's glow on press. That's attract. So it's gonna make my still fly though. And what was this one? Well, this one is this one zero gravity, or this was slow time. So there you go. If you like, here. There's everything gone. Here we go. Say for example, I throw this in the air, and I can slow time by pressing on this one. This one is a slow time button. And if I as long as I can remove the laser as long as I keep the button pressed, but as soon as I let that button go, time goes back. That's attract. What else do we have? Cool. So that's a sample set of some of those emitters, or sorry, those interactions. And now I'm going to demonstrate here on a just on a basic object how you can set up your own interactions to work with these lasers on Interact. So here is how you do that. So if you select this object, under its properties, there's all these different attributes. One is a rigid body. One is trigger activating. That means if it goes through a trigger, it'll activate it. There's others of these, and you add them through this little triangle button here. So at the very top line here, this little triangle in the circle has some things you can add. And the thing that we're going to add is what's called Interactable. And on Interactable, when you select Interactable, you'll see probably events will be expanded, and you'll see all of these things. If it's not, click this little triangle, and you'll see all these events, which is cool. Kind of like JavaScript, or kind of like other interaction systems. You've got on press, on pressing, and on release. So this will get called once. The on press will get called once when you click the VR button, the interact button. On pressing will get called for the entire time you're pressing. For example, the slow time. Well, slow time is slightly different, but you'll get the idea that, like, maybe you want something emitting persistently every frame, 90 frames a second while you're pressing it. On release gets called when you release it. So maybe you set some state or some setting on your with your on press code, and now you need to kind of undo it with your release. Hover on and hover off. And so it's basically that set of interactive events that enable these preset interactions as well. So anyway, we've added this interactable attribute here to this object. And now we can make a script under any of these events by basically pressing any of them. So they're all kind of a light gray right now. And watch, if I press on press. Oh, let me get the script window a little. So this is the Lua scripting window here. You'll now notice that on press is a little bit brighter, which means that it's over here. It's now being manipulated. It's now being like, it's now populated the Lua script. So when we press on press, it sets up in our object script, which has now been added. This object script is a script that lives on this box entity. And it's an event that gets called when there is a press from the interaction system. So when the VR controllers, and by the way, just as an aside, it also works when VR mode is off. It'll also, if you want to test it, it'll also work with any mouse controls. So when you mouse hover on, hover off, pressing, and release, it'll all work with the mouse as well. So it's designed for that kind of fast prototyping. So this on-press event is going to, we're going to be able to call a script, and we'll call this function when we press. So we can say, for example, we can get our object's, this box's rigid body, and apply a central impulse to it in the upward direction. And you can do that through script. You could either drag in the rigid body, or the way to access it, a different way to access it through script would be, again, it lives on this mesh entity, so it's this top level item, and there's a function called getRigidBody, which will bring us to here, and then we can apply a central impulse to the rigid body. So on press, we are going to do as follows: self, which gets us to here, get rigid body, open close parenthesis, that completes the function. On another function on that, now that we have the rigid body, we're going to apply central, capital C, impulse, capital I, and we're going to pass in a vector 3. What's the impulse direction? Well, I want it to go upward. So vector 3 is this internal function for composing a vector, and then you give it 3 numbers. I'm going to give it 5. I don't know what's the mass of this object. Yeah, that'll be plenty. So basically, when I click and press on this, I'm going to apply a central impulse to the rigid body of the object. Let's see if I succeeded. There we go. Here, let's go ahead and teleport our way over. And interacting, there we go. I'm clicking. I'm not grabbing it. I can't actually grab it, but I can make these. As I press it, I give it this impulse. Every time I press it, a small impulse. So that's a simple way to do an interaction. You could also make the thing go away. I could, here's another example. Now that there's an object script on this, I can edit it by right-clicking and hitting Edit Code. So what if I did this? What if I brought in this object, and I said box entity 3, box entity 3, colon, fade out and deactivate. Make sure I spelled that right. Fade out and deactivate. All right. Let's test my memory here and see if that works. Yep. And sure enough, it faded out and deactivated. You could fade in. Say, for example, I took this object, and I make it not active. Oops, is that right? What was that? Oh, that was the rigid body. Excuse me. I'm going to take it at its top level, make it deactive, and then on this object, right-click to edit its code. This is our press event for this object. I'm going to bring in that deactivated box. So that was box entity 3 copy, and it is active false. And when I bring it in, it's calls itself box entity 3 copy, and I could even just call it box 3. So I can type less. Box 3 colon fade in. I think that works. Let's see. Maybe I'll throw an error. No shame in that. I'll just fly over this time. So one fades out and deactivates, and one fades in. And I keep fading that one in, which is, you could totally control for that. And we're still getting the impulses here. Very cool. So that is kind of an initial, soup to nuts on the VR, the interaction, and two of the possible locomotions. There's plenty more. Let me show you one last thing, which is how to, if you want your VR experience to be viewed stereoscopically, or monoscopically. So right now, when I press VR, it spits out this this stereoscopic image. So what I want to do is control that under displays in preferences. So sorry, let me just re-explain that. This is probably obvious to some people, but maybe not. If I want this to be just one image, not each eyeball, I need to control that under displays. If I want it to basically look like this, but during present time, this monoscopic view. So let's set that up. And the way you do that is under Edit, Preferences, and then under Outputs, you'll realize that there's a master display and this HMD camera display. What I have an option here is for what I'm going to do is create a new output, a new display output, and I want to say new screen display output. And so I've got the master display, and then I've got this HMD camera display, which is screen display. It's going to render as screen as opposed to render as stereoscopic VR. It's going to render as screen. And the quality profile can be reduced. That'll be that's like good. You can do master if that, it'll take some more kind of compute power to do it. Reduced seems to look fine. It does a little bit less work on some of the lighting quality, and it's the resolution kind of travels with it. So I would say, kind of for best performance results, you're going to want to leave the defaults. So it'll be HMD camera display, new screen display output, screen, render as screen, quality profile reduced, resolution auto. And then this is, say you have a separate monitor. In fact, I have a external monitor in here, and it's to the right side of my PC. So I could place that display over there, and I'll then have the view over on that display. So this is how you can kind of control your monitors and displays. I won't go into the full depth. There's separate tutorials for this, but this is how you would accomplish this. I'm going to stay left because left is my PC. I'm going to hit OK. Now, when I go into VR present mode, you'll see it's no longer stereoscopic. And when I look in the VR headset, it renders normally, or it renders like VR. So it's actually stereoscopic in my VR headset, and it is monoscopic for you, which is good, so that outside viewers can kind of see in without having to suffer the weirdness of the stereoscopic view. Very cool. There you go, VR 101.